Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar brought to you by Techstrong, AWS, and Harness. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. We've got an exciting panel ahead of you, but before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available to you shortly after this concludes, and you will have a link to access as well. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. This is also where you'll find the chat tab where you can engage with the speakers or your fellow audience members, share your thoughts, just let us know where you're signing in from, whatever you want to talk about. Finally, the conclusion of our webinar will have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around, make sure you're one of the winners. Let's go ahead and kick off our program and talk about modernizing software delivery for regulated industries with Harness and AWS. Today, we're joined with Vineet Bhaskar, Vice President of New Product at Harness, and Eric Barron, Principal Leader, DevOps, Global Financial Services at AWS. Eric, I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to you while I launch a poll.
Fantastic, Jared. And thank you so much. I really appreciate the time and very much looking forward to this discussion. It's actually very near and dear to my heart as I've been in this regulated world, kind of helping clients implement a lot of these foundational constructs around DevOps, DevSecOps, platform engineering. Go combine them in any way you'd like. They all, in many ways, mean the same things across the board. But it's a pleasure to be here and really excited about the Harness partnership. We've seen a massive explosion here in really helping our clients be as successful as possible implementing these constructs. For a quick little background on me, so again, I've actually been in this I've been in this space for the better part of 20 years now, across stints within the IBM Rational brand, WebSphere, time at Microsoft. This is actually a second tour of duty at AWS for me. I actually was part of the AWS business from 2017 to 2019 and led our DevOps segment across our public sector business, really focusing on helping to instrument and kind of maintain and help our clients maintain FedRAMP and DoD Impact Level X, SRG Impact Level X, et cetera. And kind of came back to GFS because a lot of the same problems that we saw in public sector are really bubbling up very much so on the global financial services side. And I'm very excited to talk to you today about how kind of the partnership between AWS and Harness can really enable some of those workflows across the board and help you all become more efficient in how you're looking to do software delivery. So that is me. I'm going to pass to Vineet for just a moment so he can introduce himself, and then we'll get into the meat of the dialogue here.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Happy to be here. You know, I'm actually in New York this week, and it's great to be back here. I lived in New York. I started my career in New York, actually as a software developer, working for a large financial services institution. And, you know, I don't want to date myself either, but we were at the time writing client server applications to the internet for a brokerage platform. And, you know, along the way, what I realized about myself was I was a mediocre developer at best. What I actually really love to do is try to look at problems and apply technologies to drive outcomes and unlock value. And that's kind of been a kind of a foundational principle that's guided my career since. So I've held positions as pre and post solution consulting, sales and sales leadership, always focused on the enterprise software space, primarily in the IT operations or DevOps environment. And you know, the last really 9 years have been in the startup world. So I was part of a company that was a packaged analytics company focused on both predictive and descriptive analytics for the DevOps space, and helped scale that company all the way up through acquisition. And now I'm at Harness, and I get the honor and the privilege to lead our product specialist sales team here, which is all around thinking through how are we bringing all this great new innovation to market to help service our clients. A large part of that client swath is in the regulated industry. So, you know, really excited to dig in on the discussion today.
That's fantastic. And what Vineet's not telling you, by the way, is that this is actually a second tour of duty of he and I getting a chance to work together, as we were part of the same company for a little bit of that run in the last year. So let's start in the best way that any AWS presentation starts with showing our wonderful shared responsibility model slide. I can promise you that if you've had a briefing from anybody from the AWS business, this is a slide that's been put up. But it's really, really important in the context of really what we are talking about, as well as when we look at the different types of trends that really are existing in just regulated industries in general. Now, I kind of had said I've been in public sector, I've worked different parts of healthcare, some of the other kind of core regulated markets, but my sole focus now really is in global financial services. And it's been a really interesting journey here, coming back over the last year and engaging with clients, because much of what the banks had been kind of thinking about, the capital markets accounts, you think your investment firms, insurance, it isn't really a question anymore of if they're going to move to a cloud provider. It truly is when and how quickly. And I think you've probably heard before Andy Jassy's famous quote of "There's no compression algorithm for experience," right? And really what that's coming down to is AWS has been around the longest as the hyperscaler. But what's been a fascinating thing that's happened as we've gone and engaged the GFS market, it really has been, it's awesome that you all have been running as a cloud provider, have some amazing customer examples of where you've gone and really helped companies transform themselves. But there's a part of that compression algorithm statement, or compression algorithm for experience statement, that often gets missed. And it is very much an inflection point of where the banks and the kind of global financial services market has come after. And really what it comes down to is, yes, we have that type of tenure running as a hyperscaler, but the other side of it is what that also translates is the largest community of developers, of engineers that understand how to build for a cloud provider and transform through that motion of moving out of the data center and into the cloud back end. But what our clients are asking us, as we go back to the shared responsibility model slide, is I need you to help me with this part in the blue. I understand that you handle all of this baseline infrastructure, hypervisor and below AWS, but the way I've treated my data center and the way I've built my governance, my compliance, my security rules is really different when I'm moving to a cloud provider, and I don't want to do the same things we've been following on premise. And that is really the core of what a lot of where we've engaged with the Harness team has really brought to bear for our client segment. It's also no secret that a lot of our regulated clients are still very much to the left side of this curve. It's early days, barely scratching the surface for really embarking on the cloud journey. Even the companies that really go out and tout themselves as really leaning into cloud, it's still early. And there's been an interesting paradigm that's happened as we've engaged and gone out and worked with these various client segments, really trying to go and looking at the high water mark of teach me what Netflix does, right? Teach me how to build my business almost in a born in the cloud capacity. The reality of the situation is when we look at software delivery, when we look at DevOps, and when we marry up what clients typically are seeing, there's this interesting scale of if I'm trying to implement developer productivity and gains, I almost need to do that at the expense of risk. Or if I need to implement or really harden my risk posture, I have to do that at the expense of developer productivity. And nowhere is this more relevant in how teams are kind of growing up in the software development function and trying to really embrace cloud structures than in regulated markets. And we see this really interesting kind of dichotomy that exists between how do we make developers more productive? How do we enable operations teams to implement these workflows? But then if we're able to get to that baseline, how do we ensure that the security teams, the governance guardrails that we want to bake in from the CISO side can be instrumented and automated as part of the pipelining process? And the reality is it kind of looks a lot like this. We have a lot of customers that have implemented these different types of development platforms out at a team or even maybe a project or program level. But the way at which the CISO office still needs to harden the process by which the features, the new workloads that might be intended for a cloud provider or what we're enhancing in that particular workload, there still is this notion of I've got to build hardening around that. And I don't really understand how to take all of that stuff in the blue and inject that as part of my development pipeline. The other challenge is that even in the cloud motion, as clients go and embrace these different types of structures and really look to migrate those sets of first workloads, decommissioning the data center, we're finding it's happening at a workload level. Now, what do I mean by that? I've got a great workload that sits in the data center that now has become a candidate to lift and shift and put into a cloud provider. And the teams of folks responsible for that workload have built, for lack of a better term, a cottage industry of technologies from a software development perspective to be able to orchestrate, build a pipeline, manage how my development and operations teams can interoperate. What is the baseline of infrastructure as code I want to use? How do we configure the pipeline? How do we harden security and compliance rules? But what we're finding is once the first workload is migrated, the customers are going to the next workload and they're rebuilding the exact same thing all over again. And this concept of collaboration between how do I build patterns? How do I build reusability in not just the artifacts and the assets that teams are using to be able to accelerate their time to value, but how do I actually expose that back to other teams that are looking to migrate the next workload? And one of the most powerful things that our customers are finding in the partnership with Harness is the ability to look at how do I leverage a platform at scale across what might be 10, 15, 20,000 software engineers to start my journey with cloud, but also start my journey at the exact same time in modernizing how I'm leveraging those cloud resources. Because at the end of the day, being able to enhance productivity, but also being able to efficiently manage how we are consuming those resources in the AWS backbone is how we drive cost efficiency. And we don't want to look at a migration just as a lift and shift drop. We want to build a foundational tooling infrastructure in front of that migration so that we can start encapsulating patterns and so that the development teams are able to start to smaller chunks to become more efficient at running those services on the cloud provider, but also making sure that developers are able to offload. What is happening is a lot of the teams have to go and build in a full stack capacity. Those teams that are focused on the workload are tasked with build the infrastructure logic, help me with the pipeline, deploy the security and governance guardrails, and it's happening in vacuums. And really what we're trying to do is offload that in a more collaborative self-service way so that the developers are able to really focus on the new features that they want to go develop and generate. Now, I'm going to pass this to Vineet for a moment as he's going to take us a little bit more into how the Harness platform is enabling this for our clients.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Eric. And I think, very well said in terms of the problem statement. When I think about this, I start with the outcome in mind, and it's really, lifting and shifting these workloads to really sort of account for scalability, reliability, and the fact that you want to increase your software release velocity. And so a lot of the things that we're talking about is really why DevOps modernization has to go hand in glove with cloud migration. And so when I think about DevOps modernization, kind of 4 or 5 things are just really top of mind for the discussions that we're having with our regulated customers and prospects. First is there's no slowdown of cloud adoption, right? Containerization, serverless, moving sort of monolith applications to microservices environments in the cloud, refactoring those applications to take advantage of a lot of that scale and reliability pieces. But to do so, you really have to sort of understand that I've got to refactor those applications. I have to start thinking about how am I going to automate this entire DevOps process. And so, point number 2, automation really for me is looking at where are the bottlenecks in the process, and where are the repetitive tasks my developers and my DevOps engineers are constantly struggling with. And we have a saying at Harness that we want to automate the worst part of a developer's job, right? And so it's those repetitive tasks within your build and deployment areas as you're pushing code to customer that we want to seek to automate. The other space, as I think about automation, is AI and ML. I'm really excited about this year. I think we're going to take a massive step forward in the regulated markets in terms of how you're applying AI and ML to your DevOps processes. And we're doing this every day at Harness. And I'm going to give some very specific examples in a few minutes. But to me, it's kind of a few different areas, right? It's using AI and ML to drive automation. It's using AI to work on things like compliance and risk. It's also using AI and ML to mine data for insights across this entire process. And so if I can drive automation through a more platform-driven approach for release velocity, Eric, you were just describing, I also have to keep the bar high and think through security and compliance. And certainly across financial services and public sector and healthcare, this is top of mind for DevOps teams, that any type of process or tool that I'm leveraging in this area, I have to think about my security and compliance. And when I think about security, let's unpack that for a minute. It's kind of three areas for me, right? Cloud security. So you're thinking about, just the data movement and encryption of that data at rest and in motion. You're also thinking about how to secure those cloud resources and how to monitor access to those cloud resources. Now, application security is a big area for us, and it's one that we're constantly working with our customer base around, and have and as a part of the Harness platform have put together some really compelling capability, all centered around how to help developers build more secure coding practices into their development process. And then as I'm deploying software, how do I actually enforce the staging of those security gates within my pre-deployment process? And then lastly, we have to think about regulations, right? And so we're talking to the regulated markets, and within each of those verticals, you have certain regulations that DevOps teams have to think about. This could be PCI or GDPR or DISA STIGs, or the work that's being done under the executive order from President Biden to modernize your systems based off some really severe vulnerability and attack issues, Log4j as an example. So I have to kind of keep that in mind, and I have to be able to audit the process for compliance and assessments as I'm sort of modernizing the DevOps approach. The fourth item there is, how do we continue to help foster collaboration between our Dev and Ops teams? And for me, this breaks down into two areas are top of mind. First is your CI/CD process. I mean, this is the linchpin for where Dev and Ops really have to come together to understand, as I'm making code-based changes or I'm releasing applications, have I tested things appropriately? Am I monitoring that in the deployment? And when issues arise, how do I quickly triage and drive feedback loops? That also involves incident management. So, how do I actually have an understanding of releasing things into the wild? If I have an issue, how do I quickly triage? And then how do I build some resiliency around that into my pre-deployment state? So I'm looking at where those applications are in terms of potential issues and kind of heading off at the pass before they turn into incidents. And then the last driver for modernization for me and what we're seeing at Harness is, how do I improve both the developer experience? Because gosh, we're asking a lot of developers these days. There's all kinds of shifting left. Let's shift security left. Let's shift our resiliency and reliability left, and really put a lot of that onus on developers. All that's doing is functionally, adding more tasks to a developer. And then how do we measure the productivity of those developers, right? And so those two areas are really critical for us here at Harness in terms of providing sort of the right tools and automation capabilities to help improve that developer experience. But now, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but how do we actually measure the productivity of those developers and where they're spending their time? Eric, what do you think about that?
No, I think all of that, Vinny, is completely spot on, and it's completely in line with what we are seeing in the market. And I think one piece that I want to at least touch on here is part of this context that we're moving a workload. Now I'm maybe tasking developers to do more operational tasks, build my template, set my pipeline, integrate my source control with my CI/CD mechanism, inject my security scanning capabilities across the board, help me with my release process. We're really seeing over the course of the last probably 10, 15 years that there's been a lot of best of breed tooling implementations that have grown up in those vectors. So not only are developers needing to go focus on how do I wire all of that together per workload to make that happen, but the work is actually being lost on them, meaning that the next team can't rebuild or can't reuse a lot of what those groups are doing. And quite honestly, it is why we are seeing a shift in the GFS market in particular to move towards a more platform focus from a development perspective. Because being able to consume and build those patterns that developers can then spin up when they see fit to focus on feature development, and then being able to really get the data as to how we are operating across the board to drive ways for us to save costs, to become more efficient, and offload more and more of those kind of remedial tasks away from development to focus in on build the most compelling features for the businesses and the customers that we support. We're seeing a big push of that in the market today.
Yeah, and so are we. And so just to kind of juxtapose all of the modernization drivers with a visual of what you're describing, Eric, it's really sort of, this is where we start. And so let's not forget, within these regulated environments, there's a lot of efforts that are going on and underway to modernize this process. But if you look at sort of the current state of the SDLC, it is very tool heavy. It's very siloed in nature and in terms of the process. It there's oftentimes no concept of sort of governance and audit history, and it's being held together to drive some semblance of automation through heavy scripting. And a lot of the outcome of a lot of effort of that is falling back on developers, right? To having to script their pipelines. And so this is somewhat of a graphical representation of what we see when we start to work with our customer base. And so just to sort of illustrate now kind of the downstream effects of that, there's a poll out there on LinkedIn that basically polled a whole bunch of developers, and overwhelmingly it came back that only less than a third of their time is actually being spent writing code. And so you got to ask yourself, well, what else are they doing? Well, they're doing all of the maintenance work to support a picture like this. And so that area is really ripe for modernization. Anything you want to add here?
No, it's the only thing I would say is for starters, this kind of set of technologies is by no means exhaustive. There is a lot more that gets added in here that we see in lots of environments. But I think one of the fundamental things we're seeing as well from a cloud perspective is, look, at the end of the day, many times the cloud conversation centers on the number of Legos that I have, right? It's just kind of the way we look at it, service breadth. And oh, by the way, when we talk scale, it's how many of those, how big's my trash can that can support all those different Legos, right? And we are seeing a fundamental shift in the industry, especially in GFS, where I need your help, AWS, to teach me where to find the Lego books and to show me how to then build my own centralized repository of those, so that when I need to build a new feature or when I need to drive another workload, I've got a repository of the way I can execute. And I think that one of the fundamental things we've been really driving in the market and really has exploded in the partnership with Harness is the ability to be that surface area for our clients.
Yeah, well said. So let's, when we talk about DevOps modernization, let's kind of look at this and zoom in a little bit, right? Because the areas we tend to get started in a few different areas, but the main sort of linchpin for DevOps modernization for me is your CI/CD process. And so if you take a look and zoom in here, what are the sort of negative consequences of this picture? Well, you're not going to be able to release at the velocity you want, basically in this type of environment, again, because it's very tool and process heavy. There's no concept of governance and guardrails, right? It becomes really difficult to sort of have audit history of your software deployments in a scenario like this. And then it's a lot of manual work that's being done across your developers and DevOps teams. And so this is where Harness really tends to dig in on the CI/CD process. And we talk about a modernized platform for delivery, for software delivery. That's everything from code to customer. It's modular in nature, so we can start with your biggest problems first, but we tend to start here with CI/CD, moving to a picture like this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, some fairly powerful concepts that we employ as a part of this modern sort of software delivery platform at Harness. And so the first, we are talking to regulated industries, and so it's governance, right? It's a hallmark of everything we're doing here at Harness. And so, we use something called policy as code, really as a service, to centralize the management of all of your rules around pipeline creation, execution. And we can then distribute all of that, all of those policies that are managed centrally to all your pipelines. And we leverage OPA, Open Policy Agent, to drive a lot of that. But now we can integrate that into CI to CD and also our feature flags module to enforce governance, right? There's a few other things that I want to touch on here that I think are really critical for regulated clients. Secrets management, right? We have an internal capability and service for secrets management where you can basically manage all of your access keys. We also are very we also integrate to third-party secret management platforms out there. What you'll find with Harness is we are very sort of modular and open in nature in terms of integrations. The last point I want to make here is RBAC, or role-based access control, right? This is in and of itself a huge feature that I know our customers in regulated spaces are enjoying and leveraging and seeing a lot of value out of. It's being able to have granular access that scales over a whole host of teams, right? So think about giving 10, 20,000 developers permission in terms of who can do what from a pipeline creation execution standpoint, who can approve, who can deny. Well, I have to have a centralized area to manage all of those permissions. Otherwise, I'm spending a lot of manual time trying to manage all of that permissions work. And so all of that kind of makes up a very strong sort of governance posture that's traceable, that's auditable at any given time. Second concept really is configuration as a code and pipeline as code. And so really the thought here is, you can leverage the GUI editor within the Harness platform for really putting together your CI/CD pipelines in a matter of minutes. No scripting, it's really drag and drop. And that's great, and that our customers do love that capability. But imagine now that I have to scale that over hundreds of applications and thousands of developers. Well, we also have a concept of pipeline as code and configuration as code, which essentially allows you to use YAML and start to build that configuration really in code. So I can start to really put together pipelines, triggers, workflows, environments, really store those as code. And the value of that is you're going to gain scalability, you're going to gain auditability, traceability, and versioning control of those pipelines. And so it's a very key concept in terms of how we're delivering some of the capability around our platform. So now let's talk a little bit about some very specific examples of automation, because I have a big pet peeve about folks using AI and ML buzzwords and not giving very specific examples. And so let's drive some of those examples across our CI/CD platform here. So first and foremost, on the configuration, on the CI side of the house, our enterprise CI and our hosted CI solution are built on top of Drone. And so that Drone is Drone is the most loved open source CI product in market today. You can check all the stars on GitHub for just how developers really love that product. And so we've tried to take the best of those feature sets and put them into an enterprise version. But let me talk specifically around two features that really show you the breadth and depth of the AI and ML capability here. We have a feature within Harness CI essentially called cache intelligence, where I can actually start to cache my most well-known used directories. So think of like Java, Node.js. I can start to cache those to basically shrink my execution of my pipeline, right? What we're really trying to strive for here is shrinking the pipeline execution time within that code to artifact process, and then really shrinking the build time, right? So making that whole cycle more efficient for my developers. And so we do that for cache intelligence. We also have a feature called test intelligence, which helps shrink the build times. And essentially what we do there is we can correlate code changes to the right unit tests that need to be run. So without this feature, what happens is a developer makes a change in the code. You have to essentially run unit tests across that whole code base, because I cannot deduce what tests need to run based off perhaps changing a few lines of code. So you're talking about extended build times really for no reason. So we're employing test intelligence to, again, help decrease some of that build time. Let's talk a little bit about continuous delivery and some of the kind of modernization efforts where our customers are really seeing value in here. So first and foremost, GitOps is really becoming sort of a standard for a lot of things, right? I mean, put simply, it's managing operations using Git as your single source of truth. And so you can do things, really around infrastructure provisioning, release automation, and yes, continuous delivery is becoming a fast standard deploying in the GitOps framework. But you still have the same issues around governance and scale, and how do I really apply all of those concepts to a GitOps environment? And so that's where we have sort of enterprise-ready GitOps or GitOps as a service as a part of continuous delivery. Just to touch on a couple other points here, and again, specifically around AI and ML, continuous verification, right? So here we're able to now tie into your observability platforms and your telemetry platforms. So think of your like Splunk, your Datadogs, your App Dynamics, and you're starting to build a unified picture of what a normal deployment looks like in production. So what I can then do is once I release another piece of an application or service, I can understand drift detection. So I've released a piece of code and it's not performing the way it typically performs according to my observability and telemetry systems. Well, if I can first alert, right, without a human involved, so I'm really cutting down on the overall just understanding issues in production. Now, if I couple that with automated rollback capability, so I can actually pull that deployment back, again, without any human interaction, you're starting to create really strong cycles of efficiency. And so, you ask, one of those things developers, I think, hate to do are babysit their deployment. So we are functionally taking that off the plate and letting them go work on what they're really good at doing, and not necessarily babysitting deployments and unwinding deployments when issues occur. So lastly, on this slide, I just want to, since we are talking about regulated industries, I want to give a customer example. So I'll talk about Citigroup, one of the largest global financial services companies in the world. And Citigroup had an interesting problem to solve. So as part of their Lightspeed initiative, and part of that initiative really was an internally built sort of DevOps platform for handling the application onboarding process for all of Citi's business units. So you can think about that scale, and you're talking about 20,000 plus developers. And the issue that they were finding was that they weren't really truly doing continuous delivery. And so they understood really early on that they were having issues hitting velocity goals. They didn't really have this concept of an end-to-end sort of repeatable pipeline. And so Harness became involved, and we sort of proved out our continuous delivery capability here. And really, Citi saw a lot of value in a few areas. First and foremost, we just talked about a few of them, automated rollbacks, right? So being a regulated customer in the financial services vertical, understanding and the ability to pull back deployments was a huge value add for them. It gives them the sort of comfort and peace of mind that I can automate this process should something go awry in my once my software is released. Another area was just deployment history, right? So they were spending a lot of time looking back through their deployments because there was no concept of audit and history. And so, if you want to unwind a deployment, there's a lot of milestones in there around unit testing and what was done. And so they would have to sort of look through all those deployments individually versus now in Harness, it's all there for you. Every service that you deploy can be fully inspected, and you're looking at everything that's done from code, from bringing that from really code to production. And one of the last things was RBAC, right? Just because we talked about it, imagine scaling permissions to 20,000 plus developers, and so they found a lot of value in just how the RBAC permissions worked, how easy it was to kind of understand and then roll out those permissions to their developers. And so, wanted to give kind of an example that crystallizes a lot of what we're doing across the global financial services verticals, but also other verticals as well, like public sector, healthcare. We're seeing sort of those efficiency gains play out as a result of some of these modernization efforts. So I think, that speaks to this picture here as you're starting to modernize that process, Eric. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think that the most compelling piece, really what you had described, Vinny, is this ability to build these packages of patterns, right? When you go back to that slide that you had up previously, when you've got multiple point solutions wired together, right? When you expand that across what might be, again, 10, 20,000 devs, you're trying to wire each of those per workload. Sometimes it's even per component of a workload, right? And while, yes, you can get the benefit of moving and getting kind of the 20 to 30% cost savings by leveraging elasticity and scalability of the cloud platform and be able to take advantage of the capital expenditure to operate an expenditure move, what we're really finding clients are asking us now is, how do I patternize? How do I centralize the consumption of what I need from a tooling infrastructure, what I need from a compliance guardrail, how I stage my pipeline, how I execute across that release motion, and how do I expose that success to the other teams inside my business that can build on the shoulders of that? Because if the first workload my team drives that, implements that infrastructure, and 60% of what they're using could be leveraged by workload team 2, I've just gotten you 60% of an efficiency gain in your time to value of really driving that transformation. And it builds this flywheel of reuse within the business to help teams continue to get better and faster at iterating on those constructs. The other thing that we're seeing a lot is, once I've kind of built those baselines in operations and security, I do that at the beginning of the migration process. DevOps, and I've had this conversation a lot, DevOps is not an output of moving a workload to the cloud. As a matter of fact, our own implementation of DevOps at Amazon.com is actually what led to the invention of AWS, because we needed to learn how to be more efficient in building these packages of automation for the development teams. But what it also allows us to do is, once we've driven the migration and have that tooling infrastructure sitting underneath where the teams are able to collaborate, it gives us an opportunity to start chunking that workload into smaller pieces. And that obviously allows us as a client to become much more efficient at running that workload in the cloud provider. Hence, how do I save myself money? That was the promise of cloud in the first place. But also, how do I start to actually decompose those services, not just to help teams operate and develop more quickly and efficiently, but maybe those packages of services could be shared or used from other workloads that we're looking to migrate and modernize in general.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And when we talk about DevSecOps, this is a space we're very much helping our both regulated and non-regulated customers really achieve some I think phenomenal results. If you think about it, this is a series of stats from the State of DevSecOps report from 2021. Still holds true. I mean, the big finding here was that inefficient automation in the software development process is really the largest cause for delays with releases. If you unpack that a little further, 75% of respondents reported that sort of manual security and compliance processes slow down your code release. 96% of those respondents actually said that they would benefit from automation and security and compliance processes. Yet more than half also said that, you know, a barrier to DevSecOps adoption is a technical hurdle. And that's playing out in every conversation that we're having as we're really sort of working in this space quite heavily now in helping, as I was mentioning, you know, helping organizations really actually shift left by working and building in more security coding practices into their development process and really trying to drive enforcement of that process all the way up through application release. And so so before I kind of talk a little bit about what we're doing here at a finer grain, any comments there, Eric? Does that ring true to you?
Yeah. So let's even take this further, right? So we've talked about kind of for lack of a better term, I know I've used this a few times, but the cottage industry that kind of grows up under the CI/CD function, right? As part of that, now we're going to talk about the execution to ensure the integrity of that application, of that workload is intact. Again, everything in the blue. And that can be everything from how are we using strategic consumption of open source as a driver of efficiency in development. Well, when we do that, we know 99% of production applications have open source or open source dependencies on them. So I need to scan for that. Then I need to understand, how do I execute a scan as part of the pipeline on, is the application that I've built secure? Are there known common vulnerabilities either in my open source logic or in the new code that I've built? How is that potentially triaged down to my infrastructure as code layer? Am I introducing areas in that vector? And so on and so forth, right? So you have this implementation of these best of breed tools that then we have these siloed scans that happen that need to be executed that many times are owned by a completely separate function with no real visibility into how the software delivery mechanism is supposed to be intact. So we've talked about stitching together a bunch of technologies. We're now talking about executing disjointed security scanning processes and then trying to package all of that up so that if I go into an audit requirement under PCI as an example, I have a way to produce some type of artifact that says, look, I ran scans against these. I've married to these regimes. And what we are finding again is the ability to drive more and more of that execution in that packaged pattern of how the teams are consuming the development function platform itself has become an emerging requirement across the board. And it is allowing us to become and help our clients become much more efficient in really consuming cloud in a value-based way.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So let's unpack that a little bit further, right? Because what we're doing to sort of address and help our customer base here is we've brought to market a product called Security Test Orchestration. And so when I think about those challenges, we just saw the stat on technical challenges. You're describing really an ongoing problem that essentially is a data problem, right? I have all of these different scan technologies in that entire process. I have to run my static code scans at builds. I have to run my container scan, my dynamic scans at the time of as I'm building my artifacts. I've got to run open source scans because, you know, as you mentioned, I think I saw a stat out there that 70% of applications today are made up of open source components. And so I have to take all of that into account. What's happening on the ground, though, is all of those scanners are producing a massive amount of data. And so there's a data challenge in trying to parse that data, understand that data, and oftentimes a lot of that scan data overlaps. And so it's a very inefficient process, and it is functionally a barrier to implement stronger DevSecOps practices. So what we're doing, one capability within the STO product is we're using our intelligent scanning engine to correlate all of that data together, to deduplicate the overlap, and to produce a consolidated list of known vulnerabilities that I can then democratize across my AppSec and my software engineering team. So now I'm breaking down those communication silos. I'm not scanning late in the process and hitting developers with a bunch of unplanned work and remediation that has to happen. I'm actually doing this in a much more systematic way. And so that's a huge problem to go solve, and one we're doing today with our client base. The other that you're hitting on is enforcement within the CI/CD process. And so how do I my security stage gates within my CI/CD process? So I'm enforcing the right scanning at the right time, and I'm using things like governance with Open Policy Agent within the Harness platform to actually fine grain the governance, right? Because I may let a certain security scanning vulnerabilities through a delivery pipeline based on X, Y, and Z criteria. But if I hit a threshold, I want to throttle that back. I may want to stop that pipeline in its tracks. And now I'm automating that entire process. And so again, we're creating all of these cycles of efficiency that are leading to just hours saved, time saved, and I'm de-risking this entire process of software delivery by enforcing these security staging gates. So, with that, I think of some other areas as we think about sort of regulated industries, and one of the other areas that's clearly sort of top of mind, I know it is for you as well, Eric, is all around sort of cloud cost management, and how do I help our clients that are migrating to the cloud, but yet we don't want to surprise them with runaway cloud bills. And that's actually what's happening today, right? As I'm churning more and more cloud services on, I'm using more compute capacity, I'm starting to see bills start to go, sideways and exponentially grow, and oftentimes catching customers at quite a bit of a surprise. And so I'd say, with this is a really interesting space for us. And I know one that we're partnering quite closely on. And for us, it really boils down to a module that we have in the Harness platform called Cloud Cost Management. And really, I think of this problem space as really three vectors, right? First vector is visibility and transparency of my cloud cost, and so here, you got to think about, first off, a multi-cloud environment, right? How do I actually create sort of cost transparency across a multi-cloud environment? But then how do I look at sort of applications, microservices, within those microservices, my Kubernetes clusters and resource utilization, right? Really down to what's utilized, what's idle, what's unallocated. And I really have to start to account for those costs. And so we're doing that with our cost transparency capability within Cloud Cost Management. And then we have this concept called cost perspective. So you can start to layer in business context. So, my engineering teams might want to look at that cloud cost really in a certain way versus my business leaders or my IT finance teams. And so giving that business context to our cost visibility and transparency is really key. Second is optimization, right? So if I can get really granular around my cost transparency issues, how do I then automate that? How do I then look for optimization areas? And so this is really another exciting space for us, where we're applying AI and ML. We have a feature called auto stopping that essentially looks at all those cloud resources and can start to spin down idle resources, and essentially be intelligent enough to spin those resources back up when needed, so there's no service disruption. We're finding that a lot of our large regulated clients are seeing 40, 50, 60% of savings off their cloud bill just by deploying that. And then there's, we're running short on time, but there's other things we're doing in the optimization space around spot instance orchestration. We just introduced cluster orchestration for EKS, and I do want to touch on that because that's very much built on top of the AWS Spot Ready program. So we're using sort of best practices that AWS is leveraging in here to actually integrate. And really, that's all around customers closing the gap around spot instance availability guarantees. And so we're automating that entire process. And then lastly, just to touch on a little bit of just governance, really to me, that's all around budgeting and forecasting. So how can I use some ML capability to actually forecast demand and understand what my cloud cost bill will be in the out months based on prior spend? And then, lastly, bringing together CCM and continuous delivery, I can start to tag those cloud infrastructure pieces as they're being built within the continuous delivery pipeline. So now I'm not going through an exhaustive exercise of figuring out, where that cloud infrastructure came from and how do I have to go account for it. I'm getting it as it's being created. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, Vineet, this is actually a really, really interesting topic, and one we could probably spend even a couple hours on, right? But I think the real big takeaway here is many cloud solutions, when you're looking at kind of how do I understand where my spend is, are typically pictures and dashboards that give me a look back on a historical trend, right? And we're very much seeing the need and the ask of our clients to push that information into the actual pipeline itself, because I want to understand how or what resources my developers can utilize in that self-service workflow. But then the other side of it is, how do I bake a governance guardrail in place that actually sets the actual environments I can utilize and deploy, as well as ensure that we're turning them off when we don't need them? That's a massive area where, even on top of the security compliance vector, the cloud cost optimization piece and baking that governance guardrail is a major, major area we're seeing an uptick in the partnership with Harness for our clients today.
Yeah, that's well said. So, I'm really excited about this space. And so, we're talking about modernization and how to sort of take, processes and create efficiencies. We announced early last month, actually a few weeks ago, around a really exciting acquisition that Harness has made in this space of a company called Propello. And we're bringing to market now a module called Software Engineering Insights. And really Propello was focused on how do you measure the entire sort of SDLC and DevOps process. This is a space that is just ripe for a solution, because if you think about it today, a CTO really doesn't have, we talk about a platform for software delivery for a CTO. How about the ability to baseline metrics across the entire process? And I equate this to, your CRO having Salesforce, right? That gives you deep workflow capability, but also deep metrics around performance, and you can say the same for the CMO and marketing platforms out there. But yet there is no way to sort of understand, and what you can't measure, you cannot improve. And so when we talk about modernization efforts, it's really critical to understand a baseline of how I'm doing today from a velocity perspective. How am I doing today from a developer productivity perspective? How do I actually look at this entire process from code commit to production and understand, where do I actually want to start from a modernization effort? I mean, we talked about CI/CD being really important, but the fact is, if I can start to measure these areas, I can start to build a modernization sort of roadmap around how I'm going to tackle the least inefficient parts of the process, and then build from there. And so the great thing about Software Engineering Insights is we're taking into account sort of standard metrics like DORA and others to really provide sort of a baseline capability of how I'm doing today. And then we can start to measure improvements over time that are really going to measure the modernization output, right? How am I actually doing as I'm modernizing my CI/CD process? How am I actually doing as I'm modernizing the way I approach feature management? I've talked about efficiency and hours saved. How do I actually know that I'm improving? And so this is a really interesting space for us, and one that I know I'm going to be personally really excited to talk about over the next year.
100%. And I think that this context of being able to set us all on a path of prioritizing what is the highest value features, workloads, new applications that I can go build based on my historical ability to deliver is really the state that we're helping our clients get to within the fullness of time.
Yeah, so I know we're going to run short on time here, but I think just a visualization, right? Because we talk about a modernized platform for software delivery, and there's really some tenets around that modernized platform, which we've talked about, right? It's using automation, it's using AI, it's using things like policy as code and infrastructure and pipeline as code, and really all around wrapping governance. But really the outcomes are how do we help drive velocity and keep the bar high for security and do so in an efficient and reliable manner. And so if you look at sort of that end-to-end process, we talked a lot about sort of continuous integration and security test in the build and test phase, but there's other modules within the Harness platform like chaos engineering that are going to help us drive better reliability and resiliency by testing those applications pre-production to really understand where are my risk areas, right? Really, really kind of teasing those out to address them prior to delivery. We talked a lot about continuous delivery, but things like feature flags, and we're trying to reimagine how feature management is done at scale with our large customers and put the same governance and guardrails around feature management. So if I do happen to, we all know bad features are going to get out. If a feature makes it out that is causing harm in a regulated environment, that could be a very serious issue. And so how do I identify that? How do I triage it? How do I roll it back quickly? And then in the managing the business impact area, I do just want to touch on our service reliability area, right? We talked about cloud costs, but could I actually build some better reliability practices in my pre-production spaces? Can I manage to serve the concepts like SLOs and SLIs and really leverage error budgets to tune up or tune down how fast my development teams can go, right? Based on those results, and starting to tie these areas together is going to be really interesting, like SRM and chaos engineering. And that's the path we're on. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about it. You want to be able to optimize this entire process. You want to show the modernization value gains. You want to be able to baseline where your problems are today. And that's all coming out of our software engineering module. And so if you put all this together, it's really what we're talking about when we talk about sort of the modernized platform for software delivery.
Yeah, and I think that, again, why are our customers going in this direction, and why are we so excited about the partnership with Harness across the board from an AWS perspective? This is really giving our clients a facility to do both increase velocity and increase risk profile at the same time, all while being able to modernize delivery of those assets, being able to measure the impact of the development, and being able to measure the cost effectiveness and cost impact of how the client is getting better and better at consuming the AWS backbone in a value-based way to deliver on really what the promise of the whole cloud motion was in the first place, which is help me get faster, help me get more efficient, and really help me delight my customers in as efficient and a quality way as we would see fit.
Well, Eric, when you and I get together, there's no shortage of words. No. And I see we have 3 minutes left. I know we're both really passionate about this space. With that, perhaps open it up to questions. I don't know if there's any questions out there. I don't think there are.
Not that I'm seeing. Jake, I don't know if you're seeing me, but not on my end.
I am not seeing any questions on my end.
Great. Well, good thing we used the whole hour.
We are.
But yeah, hopefully this was productive, and yeah, enjoyed spending some time with you, Eric, as always, and chatting about some things I know we're both really passionate about.
Likewise. Very much looking forward to working with all of you. If any questions, obviously find me on LinkedIn, find me on GitHub. I am more than happy to reach out and answer any of these questions as we move forward, and I know Vineet will. Enjoy it. Looking forward to working with you in the future.
All right, that was outstanding. Thank you very much, Vineet and Eric, for taking the time to join the discussion and share your expertise with us. Quick reminder that today's session was recorded. Following this panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording for the on-demand. You can also go find the recording on DevOps.com website. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it'll be waiting for you there. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do have 4 gift cards to give away for Amazon. Amanda H., Weston G., Peter T., Lewis M. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye out in your inbox so you can claim your gift card. If you don't see the email in your inbox, be sure to check your spam folder. Vineet, Eric, unless you have any final words, I want to thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
Nope. Thanks, Jared. Appreciate it.
Good on my side. Thank you all.
All right. Yep. Yes, thank everyone. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and AWS Harness for sponsoring today's program. That concludes today's program, and I will be signing out. Have a great day.
Excellent. Thanks
Thank
all.
you.